Connie and Rollo. Chapter 1. Calculating Connie. Connie Button seemed a very ordinary baby. Not to Mr. and Mrs. Button, of course. They thought she was the most wonderful baby ever, as parents do. Which she was, though at first they didn't know it. When Connie was about 18 months old, and she still hadn't spoken a proper word, she made noises, of course, as babies do, but they didn't make sense. Mr. and Mrs. Button were eagerly looking forward to the moment when they would understand something she would say. "Harold," said Mrs. Button one fine day, when her husband came home from work, "it's happened." "What's happened, Muriel?" asked Mr. Button. "Connie has spoken her very first word." "I say, what fun! What was it?" said Mr. Button. "One." "One what?" "No, that's what she said. She said 1. That was her first word." "I say, that's odd," said Mr. Button. "I wonder what she'll say next." Some weeks later, Mr. Button arrived home to be told that Connie had spoken her second word. "And what was that?" he asked. 2. "She said 2?" "Yes," said Mrs. Button. "And then, what do you think? She said 1, 2. "I say," said Mr. Button, "that is odd. I wonder what she'll say next." You might perhaps guess that the third word Connie Button spoke a month or so later was 3, and you'd be right. And indeed she said 1, 2, 3, as Mrs. Button told her husband when he got home. And for quite a long time that was all the child said, but I doubt if you could guess what happened next on Connie's second birthday. Mrs. Button was dangling Connie on her knee. Mr. Button was drinking a cup of tea, and Connie Button was saying 1, 2, 3. And you might perhaps think that Connie was about to say 4. You'd be wrong. Connie swallowed a mouthful of birthday cake and then loudly and clearly said 1, 2, 3, 6. "No, Connie," said Mrs. Button. "It's 1, 2, 3, 4. "It's not," said Connie. "It is," said Mrs. Button. Connie Button's little face went red. She clenched her fists and drummed angrily on her mother's knee. 1, 2, 3, 6, she shouted. "I say," said Mr. Button, "what a fuss! Why is she making a fuss, Muriel? She can't know what she's done wrong." 1, 2, 3, 6, yelled Connie furiously. And suddenly the truth dawned on Mrs. Button. "She's right, Harold. Don't you see? She's not counting, she's adding." She cuddled Connie and dried her tears. 1 and 2 and 3 make 6. That's what you're trying to say, aren't you, darling? What a clever girl." "I don't think I can believe that," said Mr. Button. "Anyway, I don't know how the child's been learning these numbers. Have you been teaching her?" "No," said Mrs. Button. "She just comes out with them." 7, 9, 16, said Connie. "You see," said Mrs. Button, 7 plus 9 equals 16. "I say," said Mr. Button, "that's odd." "It's not," said Connie, "it's even." Did you hear that? The child knows the difference between odd and even numbers. "I can't believe it, Muriel," said Mr. Button. "Try her, Harold." Mr. Button addressed his little daughter. 10, he said. "Even," said Connie. 5. Odd. "Add 8 to 3, 11. Add 4 to 13, 17, said Connie. "I say," said Mr. Button, "the child's a genius, Muriel. Only 2 years old, and she can add 4 and 13 correctly. She's a mathematical genius." "Perhaps she can do even better, Harold. Who knows?" said Mrs. Button. "Try her with a harder sum." Mr. Button smiled and took out his pocket calculator. "She won't do this in a hurry," he said. "Now then, Connie, listen carefully to Daddy and see if you can add these two numbers together. 1,356 plus—" "Oh, Harold," said Mrs. Button, "don't be ridiculous." "It's only for a joke, Muriel," said Mr. Button. "Of course you won't be able to do it. Listen, Connie. 1,356 plus 903. Connie Button's little face wore a frown of concentration. She pursed her lips and stuck out the tip of her tongue and screwed up her eyes. "Told you," said Mr. Button. "Poor little love," said Mrs. Button. 2,259, said Connie. Chapter 2. Mrs. Button was doing her shopping, pushing Connie around the supermarket in the trolley. and as she put the first item in, Connie said, 1. And the child continued to count as the fish fingers and nappies and bread and margarine and all the other things were loaded up, until they approached the checkout, and Connie said, 24, and Mrs. Button knew she'd bought 2 dozen items. The next time they went shopping, she said to herself, I'll try telling Connie the price of everything as we go along, just for fun. You never know, she might be able to add them all up. She picked up a bottle of tomato sauce and showed it to Connie. This is 46 pence, Connie. And Connie nodded. There'll be lots more, said Mrs. Button. Can you add them all together for me? And Connie nodded. So up and down the aisles they went, while Mrs. Button called out the prices as she loaded up the trolley. Tea, 66 pence. Biscuits, 54 pence. Tin of salt, 38 pence. Small tin of chopped ham with pork, 37 pence. Honey, £1.59 pence. And on it went till the trolley was full, and each time Connie just nodded. I think that's it, Connie, said Mrs. Button at last. She'll never have remembered that lot, poor little mite, she said to herself. That kind of mental arithmetic would be too hard for the cleverest of adults. Anyway, she probably was just nodding and not listening to what I said, but I can't resist asking. As they moved towards the checkout, Mrs. Button said, How much altogether? £17.20, said Connie. Opening her purse with your fingers crossed is not easy, but Mrs. Button managed it, and as the checkout girl started to ring up the purchases, she placed on the counter a £10 note, a £5 note, £2 coins, and a 20p piece. £17.20, please, said the checkout girl at last, and then realised that the exact money was sitting there waiting. Fancy, she said. Do you add 'em up as you go along? Mrs. Button smiled. My little daughter does, she said, and the checkout girl laughed loudly at the idea that it was so ridiculous. Whatever will Harold say when I tell him, thought Mrs. Button. Well, apart from the first 2 words, I know what they'll be. I say, said Mr. Button, when he was told. Do you mean to tell me, Muriel, that Connie added up all the things you bought in her head and came out with the right answer? Yes, Harold, said Mrs. Button. And you bought a large number of different things? Oh, yes, said Mrs. Button. An awful lot. I don't know how many. 27, said Connie. I say, said Mr. Button. And I tell you another thing, Harold, said Mrs. Button. Because I was looking carefully at prices to tell Connie what they were, I found lots of bargain, and saved some money, about 5%, I should say. What's percent? Said Connie. Well, Connie, said Mr. Button, when Mummy says she saved 5%, it means she saved 5p in every pound, so that she only had to pay £17.20 instead of, let me work it out, he said, and he put his hand on his pocket calculator. £18.10, said Connie. Mr. Button took out his little machine and pressed the buttons and shook his head in amazement. Muriel, I don't need this thing any more. We have our own human pocket calculator. Not only adding, but subtracting, dividing and multiplying came easy to Connie, the Buttons soon discovered, and life became much simpler for them. Thanks to Connie, Mrs. Button always knew where her household expenses were, while Mr. Button, who ran his own business, found his daughter's skill most useful. His bills and receipts, investments and tax and VAT returns were all child's play to Connie. She needed some help, of course, for though she knew her numbers, she couldn't read any words. But her calculations were always correct to the last decimal point. No computer could have done better. How proud the Buttons were of her at first. Just think, said her mother, what she could be when she grows up. Professor Constance Button, the world's greatest mathematician, her father said. They never tired of telling Connie how clever she was. She might work out the price of curtain material, in her head, of course, because she couldn't yet manage a pencil. And Mrs. Button would say, That's brilliant. Or she might tot up a long list of different purchases, plus VAT at 17.5%, and Mr. Button would say, Fantastic! At first, Connie basked in all this praise, but as time went on, the Buttons grew accustomed to her feats of mental arithmetic, and began to accept her answers without comment. £143.35 plus £72.06 plus £107.03 plus £42.16 less 10%, said Mr. Button one day. £328.14, said Connie, and Mr. Button wrote down the answer. Connie looked sulky. Naughty Daddy. Didn't say Connie was clever. "Didn't I?" said Mr. Button absently. Connie stamped her foot. "Connie cleverer than Daddy," she said. "I say," said Mr. Button. And that was only the start of it, for Connie Button, it was soon becoming plain, was becoming swollen-headed. "That's easy," she took to saying whenever anyone asked her to do a sum, and that led to "Can't you do it yourself?" and that led to "Silly Mummy" and "Stupid Daddy." Connie, in fact, began to patronise her parents. As well as becoming rude, she became disobedient and extremely bad-tempered. "I say, Muriel," said Mr. Button one evening after Connie had gone to bed, "this is beginning to get me down. Do you know, I questioned one of Connie's answers today. I thought she'd made a mistake, so I worked it out on my calculator, but in fact she'd got it right." "Well, she would, wouldn't she, Harold?" said Mrs. Button. But there was more than a trace of bitterness in her voice. "But that's not all," said Mr. Button. "I said to her you were right, and she said, 'Of course, I always am.' And you know, Muriel, I could have slapped that child, she looked so smug. And another thing," said Mrs. Button, "she's taken to setting me problems. And if I try and write the sums down, she says, 'No, no, do it in your head, can't you? I can do it in mine.' It makes me feel such a fool, Harold." "Me too, Muriel," said Mr. Button. At that moment Connie appeared. "Can't sleep," she said grumpily. "Try counting sheep," said Mrs. Button. "How many?" said Connie. "Count to 100. That's too easy." 1,000 then. That won't take long." "Oh, count to 1,000,000," said Mr. Button. Connie looked scornfully at her father. "Silly Daddy," she said. "1,000,000,000 isn't a number. You're stupid, you are." And she flounced out of the room and up the stairs. "I say," said Mr. Button, "I'm not putting up with this any more." And he shouted loudly, "Connie, come back here." Now, whether Connie turned when she heard her father's voice, or whether she missed her footing, we shall never know. But the next thing the Buttons heard was thumpety-thump-thump as Connie tumbled all the way down the stairs, top to bottom, to lie spread-eagle on the hall floor, senseless. By the time the doctor arrived, Connie had quite recovered. The doctor examined her. "She's had a bit of a bang here," he said. "Mummy," said Connie, "can I have an apple?" "Ah," said the doctor, smiling. "An apple a day keeps the doctor away. How many apples would that be each week, Connie, eh?" And Connie didn't reply. The doctor laughed. "She's much too young to know her numbers, of course," he said. "I say," said Mr. Button. But then he caught his wife's eye and didn't say any more. They waited until the doctor had gone, and they looked at each other again. "You heard what the doctor said, Muriel," said Mr. Button. "I did, Harold," said Mrs. Button. "Wouldn't it be a relief if Connie couldn't calculate, and wasn't always right, and always able to do sums that we couldn't, and always saying 'silly mummy' or 'stupid daddy'? In fact," said Mr. Button, "if she was just an ordinary 2-year-old." They looked at Connie playing happily with her toys. "Try her with an easy sum, Harold," Mrs. Button said. "Connie," said Mr. Button, "what's 5 times 9?" 2010, said Connie. Mr. Button held up 4 fingers on one hand. "Connie," he said, "what have I got here?" "Fingers," said Connie. "Yes, but how many?" 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 6, 10, said Connie. "I say," said Mr. Button, "that doesn't sound like the future Professor Constance Button, the world's greatest mathematician." "I know," said Mrs. Button. "Isn't it lovely? She's just like any other child her age. After all, you're only 2, aren't you, Connie?" Connie smiled happily at her parents. "Yes," she said. "And when you have your next birthday," said her father, "how old will you be then?" Connie Button's little face wore a frown of concentration. She pursed her lips up, stuck her tongue out, and screwed up her eyes. She gave a huge smile. "4!" she cried, and all 3 Buttons burst out laughing. Rollo the Rhymer, Chapter 1. When Rollo was a baby, he looked quite ordinary. He crawled about and laughed and cried and made noises just like all babies do. And nobody noticed anything different about Rollo until he started to speak. The first words he said when his mother had given him a biscuit and he'd eaten it were, "Another, mother?" Nothing special about that, you might say, but the same evening his father, helping with the washing up, dropped a plate and broke it, and Rollo said, "Bad, Dad." His parents were proud, of course, that he'd started to speak, and so clearly too, but the way in which he spoke didn't strike them as unusual until a couple of months later. They were watching their baby as he played on the bedroom floor, when he suddenly crawled out of the room and saying as he did so, "Follow, Rollo!" Wondering, they did as they were told, and Rollo led them to the bathroom, and on the floor beside the bath, stood his pink plastic potty, and Rollo, pointing first to it and then slapped his nappy behind, said, "Potty, potty." They took off his nappy and sat him on the potty, and he performed, and then exclaimed triumphantly, "Me, wee!" His mum and dad looked at each other. "Do you notice," whispered his mother, "that everything he says," murmured his father. "Rhymes," they both said. "Too true," said Rollo. "Perhaps it's just a fluke," they said. "No, no, not so," said Rollo. And then, as though to make sure they'd got the message, he said, "Rollo rhyme all the time." Chapter 2. As Rollo grew bigger, his rhymes grew longer. Now he was never content with a simple yes or no. At mealtimes, for example, if asked whether he would like some more, he might reply, nodding, "Second helps for Rollo, feeling rather hollow." Or, "Rollo full to brim, nothing more for him." Of course, there was no way of keeping Rollo's rhymes a secret. Other members of the family, like grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, soon grew used to the way he talked. "And how is little Rollo?" they might say one day, and he might answer, "Very well today, thank you, Auntie May." Or, "Rollo got the tummy ache, ate too much of Granny's cake." Or, "Please do not call me little, Uncle Joe, in case you hadn't noticed babies grow." And grow he did, and soon it was time for him to go to school. On his first day the teacher asked him his name, and he replied, My Rollo is my name, of course. Can you tell me what is yours?" The teacher was so surprised she simply said, "My name is Miss Rice." "That's awfully nice," said Rollo. Throughout the morning his replies to anything the teacher said to him rhymed, and at lunchtime she told the headmaster about it. The headmaster summoned Rollo to his office and said, "What's all this, sonny? Are you trying to be funny?" "Oh, sir, how lovely! You're another. Just wait until I tell my mother," cried Rollo. The headmaster looked baffled, so Rollo went on, "I'm a rhymer. Are you one too?" The headmaster shook his head in bewilderment, and when school ended and Rollo's mother came to fetch her son, he asked her what the matter was with the boy, but then he wished he hadn't. Rollo's way of speaking was catching, and by now his parents often spoke in the same way. "Now there's one thing you must understand," said Rollo's mother to the headmaster. "His way of speaking is not planned. In fact, it's just a fact that all the time you'll find that Rollo speaks in rhyme." Chapter 3. Eventually, as boys do, Rollo grew up. Always, however, he spoke the same way. For example, when he took his driving test, the examiner, sitting beside him, said, "Right then, young man, off we go and good luck." And Rollo replied, "You'll see, when we are on the road, I understand the highway code. From A to Z, from first to last, when we return I shall have passed." And so he did. Some years later, when Rollo proposed to his girlfriend, he did not, as others might, say, "Will you marry me?" but, "Since I love you and you love me, I'm hoping that you will agree to marry me, and all my life I'll be your husband and you my wife." And so they were. And later still, when children came along, Rollo of course insisted that their names should rhyme. There were 2 boys, Ronald Donald and Eric Derrick, and 3 girls, Cora Flora Nora, Molly Polly Dolly, and Letty Hetty Betty. And later still, for Rollo lived to a right old age, he passed peacefully away, surrounded by his family. To no one's surprise, his last words, though brief, were still in rhyme. "I'll say goodbye, it's time to die." And he did. And if ever you should happen upon his gravestone, you will know for sure who made up what was written on it, because this is what it says. "Beneath this noble block of stone does rhyming Rollo lie alone. In all the world you will not find another one of Rollo's kind. He spoke for better or for worse, from babe to boy to man in verse, and here for all the rest of time is written Rollo's final rhyme."